Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Alan here. Very, very special word of welcome to everybody at the Ascent, everybody at Union Cross, and everybody else that'll be joining us online. Are you ready for some good news? The gospel of grace is so simple. It is so free. It is so powerful. And today, we're going to look at another hidden jewel, an unnamed servant girl who points her master not only to his healing and to hope for his life, but ultimately is pointing him to the one true living God. It's a story of conversion of a very powerful military leader in Syria whose name was Naaman. And you find the story in 2 Kings chapter 5. And again, in order to get the full thrust of this, we really need to read our way through this chapter and take in what is really an amazing narrative. And at the center of it, this little girl, unnamed, unheralded, and used of God in such a powerful way. 2 Kings chapter 5. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. I'm going to pause kind of as we go through the text, make a few little commentary points. Leprosy draws a stereotypical type of notion in our mind about the highly infectious disease that caused people to be quarantined and was incurable. But there are many different types of skin diseases that fell under what the Bible would call leprosy, and we're not really sure exactly the nature of his leprosy. Obviously, he didn't live a quarantined life, but his condition was obviously severe. The picture of Naaman, therefore, extremely powerful, wealthy, influential, prestigious, and famous, but there was a tragic thread of pain that ran through his life, this condition that he had. Verse 2, now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went in and told his lord, the king, thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, go now, and I'll send a letter to the king of Israel. So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. There's been a lot of scholarly discussion about exactly how much wealth did this represent. One scholar has said that it's possible that Naaman conveyed in his journey more wealth than was in all of Israel at that time. He was extremely wealthy and extremely powerful, and the king of Syria had sent forth a letter with him. Verse 6, he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider how he is seeking a quarrel with me. And so the king of Israel at that time thought, this is political provocation. And he was extremely frightened by it. And at the same time, he was quite earnest and honest in his own inability to do anything about this man's leprosy. Heard one preacher comment on this who said, wouldn't it be refreshing if all of our officials in Washington would be so honest to say they don't really have the answer? So in a real sense, you get a picture here of the king of Israel saying, I don't have an answer for Naaman's problem. But, verse 8, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Elisha is the most powerful prophet in the land, and he moves freely in the royal court. And he knows that the king has become extremely upset about this. Tearing of the clothes is a sign of emotional anguish and of great grief. The king had already begun to think about what was going to happen when he could not do for this great military leader who was like the prime minister of Syria, and how it would cause political conflict and maybe give some kind of justification for the Syrians to attack Israel. And Elisha has heard this, and he says, "Tell him to come to me so that he'll know there's a prophet in Israel." And I have to pause here to say that one of the things that's very important to notice is what Elisha says here, that he'll know that there's a prophet. It doesn't say that he'll know there's a miracle worker. It doesn't say that he knows that there's someone who can do spectacular or supernatural things. He says a prophet. Because what does a prophet do? A prophet represents God. A prophet speaks on behalf of God. So to say that he'll know there's a prophet in Israel is to say that he'll know that there's a God in Israel. Okay. Verse 9. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. This huge entourage that has come. And Elisha, verse 10, sent a messenger to him saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." He didn't even go out himself. He just sent a servant out and said, "Here's what you do. Go wash in the Jordan 7 times. This is the primary river here that we got running through Israel. Go wash in it." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" He's saying, "What?" He's saying, "Now here I come. I've come expecting a great miracle from this great man of God." And Naaman is familiar with the way that religious miracle workers do their thing, and all of the spectacular ways that they'll move and do their sorceries or whatever he was expecting. And instead, he's told to just go wash in the Jordan River, and he is angry about this. So he turned and went away in a rage. Verse 13, but his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. And he was clean. So the servants are essentially saying to him, if he'd given you something spectacular to do, you would have done it, because you're a man who does spectacular things. But this is a simple thing. Why can't you do a simple thing? Verse 15, then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him. And he said, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant." Naaman is converted. It is, most commentators would say, the most dramatic proclamation of the lordship of the God of Israel on the lips of a foreigner and a foreign dignitary that appears anywhere in the Old Testament. He has come in an unbelievable, radically way to know that God is the only true God. And he wants to show a gesture of his gratitude by making a gift. But Elisha said, at verse 16, "As the Lord lives, before whom we stand, I will receive none." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And Naaman said, "If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mules loads of earth, for from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord." So most scholars think what he's talking about here is something like a keepsake. He wants to take some of the little earth of Israel back with him. It's like a memorial to what's happened in his life. That's evidently what he's saying. At verse 18, in this matter may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. And he said to him, go in peace. I'll be coming back to explain that interesting text. But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, see, my master has spared this Naaman, the Syrian, in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I'll run after him and get something from him. So Gehazi followed Naaman, and when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from his chariot to meet him and said, is all well? And he said, all is well. My master has sent me to say, there have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. And Naaman said, be pleased to accept 2 talents. And he urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver and 2 bags with 2 changes of clothing and laid them on 2 of his servants, and they carried them before Gehazi. And when he came to the hill, he took them from their hand and put them in the house, and he sent the men away, and they departed. And he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said to him, where have you been, Gehazi? And he said, your servant went nowhere. But he said to him, did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? In other words, Elisha saw in the spirit the whole scene. Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence a leper like snow. What a story. It's a story that's about healing. It's a story that is about deception. But at the heart of it, it's a story about conversion. It's a story about Naaman and how he gets led to go to meet with the man of God, and how he comes to believe in the Lord, the God of Israel. And at the heart of it is this little servant girl that pointed the way. What a beautiful, beautiful thought. How do people wind up going to church in our culture, where we now have in America the majority of people that do not go to church anymore? How do we get them to go to the church? I always chuckled at the story of a seminary professor, a preaching professor, and he told his class, I want you to practice, coming up with good sermon titles. And one student brought in a sermon title. The professor said, no, this is not very attractive. Doesn't make anybody want to listen to this sermon. He said, go back and try again. And the student brought in another sermon title, and the professor said, no, it's still not very catchy. And he said, here's what I want you to think. Imagine that you are the pastor of a church, and it's got one of those signs out front that you can change each week and put the title of your sermon on it. And imagine a bus full of people pulls up on the street next to your church, and they look and they see that sign. And I want you to come up with a title that would make those people want to jump off that bus and run into your church. And so the student went away, and he came back the next day with a new sermon title. It was called, There's a Bomb on Your Bus. How do we get people in this culture to try church? Well, the answer to this is actually unbelievably simple. 82% of people, according to a recent big survey undertaken by a church growth expert and reported by him in one of his recent books, Tom Rainer, in America, 82% of people say they would be likely to say yes if someone, a friend or family member, invited them to church. It sounds, I know at first it sounds almost astounding that would be the case, but if you think about it, in general, just in life, why do you end up doing most anything? Usually it's because someone that is a good friend or a family member invites you, whether it's trying out a different restaurant, or if a good friend invited you, said, hey, there's a great movie I'd like to go see, you want to go with me? We're just so much more likely to say yes to something if it's somebody that we love, somebody that we respect, somebody we trust. And so in a culture where that many people say they'd be likely to, here's the thing. Very few people in churches in America actually invite people to church. In fact, one study has said that only about 2 or 3% of people, Christians in America, actually invite somebody to church. And what is so interesting about this story is that at the heart of it is this little servant girl who, in a very simple way, but in a very bold way, she says, I wish that Naaman, Esther, would go to Israel. There's a prophet in Israel. I just essentially want to say these things today about the gospel. The gospel of grace is so simple and so free and yet so powerful. That's what I just keep seeing in this story. The gospel's so simple, is so free, and it's so powerful. Consider first this contrast between Naaman and the little servant girl. She's an Israelite, he's a Syrian, or in its ancient terminology, an Aramean. She is a little girl. The text calls her a little girl, but calls him a great man. She is a captive, he's a conqueror. She's a servant, he's a commander of armies. She's unknown and unnamed, but his name was known all throughout Syria. Probably, as I mentioned earlier, he was something like prime minister. He was sort of the second in command. She's poor. She has nothing. He is unspeakably rich. There couldn't be a bigger contrast. And it's so shocking, and this is what maybe is the most moving part of the whole story. It is so shocking that this little girl would want to share this good news with her master. She was taken from her homeland during one of the raids that Naaman led. Some scholars have suggested it would not have been unlikely that she saw her own parents killed by raiding forces. And she, as a little girl, was taken into captivity. She was enslaved. It was an atrocity. And she's in this household, orphaned and without her homeland. And she wants Naaman to be healed. It's a wonder that she doesn't just want more harm for him, you know? Like leprosy serves him right. You'd think that she'd be hoping he'd just die of the disease. But instead, she said, would that he would go to Israel, because I know that he'd be cured if he went and met my God. So instead of being embittered, this small, helpless, enslaved girl had something of eternal value to give. And about the only way I can explain this is it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. It is one of the most precious things that ever happens in your life if you can just have something to give to somebody in need. Even in her situation where she had every reason only to resent, she had something to give. She had a revelation to share. She had a truth. She had something she could point to. It's interesting. I know that we see that selfishness seems to be the main problem in the world. But isn't there something inside every person, except for the darkest and the bleakest of souls that have had seared hearts and seared consciences? There's still something that it's odd how somebody will take delight in being able to help you out a little bit. You know where you see this? Of course, now we've got GPS, and so we don't stop and ask for directions much anymore. But I always notice that, on the whole, people are kind of happy to be able to give you directions. People, if they know something and you don't know it, on the whole, they're generally good-spirited about that. I noticed this, and one time, a couple of years ago, I got into an area where the cell phone wasn't working, and Jeff, the executive director of Sharing the Light, was with me. We were trying to make our way from somewhere west of Dallas to some retreat center north of Lubbock, and we just were lost. And the GPS wasn't working, and it was just one of those long, flat roads and nobody out there. And I just pulled over to the side of the road and we don't even have maps. I couldn't, and so I was just wondering, what are we going to do? And a lone pickup truck pulls up behind us, and we started laughing. We were like, "Is this a scene from a movie? Is this going to turn out well?" And this old cowboy, and had a strange looking teenage son with him. Neither one of them smiled, and we told him where we're trying to go, and he said, "Follow me." So we just started following, and the whole time I'm going, are we being led into a trap, or is he going to get us where we're going? And sure enough, he got us on the right path, and he kind of went out of his way to take. People are funny, they're even some of the hardest, crustiest people. Stop and ask them for directions, they'll show you. But what about things that are, really, if you could give somebody something even so precious, there's just a delight in that. We had a funeral this week. It was a funeral for a wonderful, wonderful man, and his daughter Kathy in our church, and her dad had suffered memory loss because of stroke and disease, and back during Christmas time, she had remembered how she'd heard often that where there's memory impairment, that music can awaken certain memories and parts of the brain. And she remembered that her mom and her dad, when they were young, had gone to a Leonard Skinner concert and sat on the front row. And they said they left. They were nearly deaf for 3 days afterwards. But it was this wonderful memory that they had. And so she was with her dad, and she just thought about that. And she brought up on her phone one of the most famous Leonard Skinner songs, Free Bird. And she started playing this old rock song, Free Bird. And she said that her dad, who'd been not communicative, it was like something just woke up. And at first he cried, and then he laughed, and he could mouth the words, and then he just looked at her, and he echoed the words, the opening line of the song, "Will You Still Remember Me?" He looked at her and he said, "You remember, you remember." Now, who was more touched by the giving of that gift, the daughter or the father? It's hard to say. Because when you have a gift that's absolutely precious, that awakens some joy in someone else, or awakens something beautiful in somebody else, I'm telling you, there's nothing like that in all of life. And that's the only thing you could say about a little girl like this who's been enslaved, but somehow she delights in giving a gift to her master. It's the one thing that she could give. It didn't cost any money, but it did cost her, because in order to give a gift like that, you got to let go of resentment. You got to let go of bitterness. You got to let go of the unforgiveness in your heart for all the wounds that you've experienced in life. And she let go of it. And so in that sense, there's a deep cost to it. But she let go of that, and she gave him a gift, and she pointed him to Israel. And what's also shocking about the story is that Naaman would actually go to Israel, because there was so much animosity between Israel and Syria. Just this week, it's been reported, though we're unclear exactly what has happened, that in a rare moment, Syria had fired on some Israeli jets. The Israeli forces are still intent on trying to stop the development of some of the worst weapons that are taking place in underground in Syria to try to help equip Islamic State. There's a huge civil war, of course, going on in Syria. People have been escaping to Lebanon, to the massive refugee camps. And Syria and Israel are still in this incredibly conflictual place. Well, it's ancient. And so there was this tremendous animosity. Now just think about this. Naaman is told by a servant girl in his household that there's a prophet in Israel, and Israel is hated by Syria, and he's going to go. Overcoming all of his prejudices. I think one of the things that keeps us, by the way, from pointing people to Jesus is there's something inside of us that we're just concerned that people aren't going to be wanting to receive. And I think we just need to get over that. We don't know who's ready to be pointed to Jesus and who's not. So we might as well point people. You could have had every reason in the book that Naaman would have said no to this ridiculous statement from a little girl. But his point of need met at exactly the right time with the offer of mercy. The offer of grace, when it meets the deepest need in the fullness of time, is what leads somebody to Christ. You never know. You never know who in your own life right now. You might invite them to church. You might point them to Jesus. You might just have a cup of coffee and a spiritual conversation. And you never know who might be ready for that. Don't think that you do know. Some years ago, my precious sister-in-law, Catherine, it was so funny. She had a friend. She had some friends, and been long-term friends. And she kept thinking, I ought to invite them to Reynolda. But she just didn't. She thought, oh, they probably don't want to come. And she had this thought, so she just never invited them. Until finally, one day, her friend just said, could I go to church with you? And we laughed about this so much. We actually got them up in front of the church and told the testimony and laughed out loud about this, about how sometimes you're afraid to invite somebody, you're afraid to point somebody to Jesus, and they might have been saying, I was hoping you would ask. We just don't know. Naaman went to enemy territory, and he had so much power and so much wealth and the same need that every single person has in the end. So all that is to say, do you see how simple the gospel is? How simple the offer of grace is. A little girl, a huge man of stature, and it's so simple. And he comes to receive this gift, and he is initially offended by what Elisha says to him. Elisha just sends a messenger. He doesn't even go out himself. And he just says, go and wash in the Jordan River. And initially, Naaman is offended by this because it seems too simple. Right? I was rereading some old writings by an Argentinian evangelist and pastor, Juan Carlos Ortiz. Funny, powerful man of God. And I was remembering back to a time he said he was trying to describe how simple the gospel is to his congregation. And so one day he looked out at the congregation and he just said, what is 2 plus 2? And everybody thought it was a rhetorical question. He said, no, I don't mean a rhetorical question. He said, what is 2 plus 2? And nobody said anything. You know. It was a trick. And he asked it repeatedly. And everybody the more he asked it, the more people shrank back in fear of blurting out some simplistic answer. And finally, he said, sitting up towards the front was a professor in the university, a math professor. And he said, Professor, can you tell us what is 2 plus 2? And kind of sheepishly grinned, the professor said, I don't know. And finally, Juan Carlos Ortiz looked at a 5-year-old who was sitting up towards the front and said, can you tell me what is 2 plus 2? And the little boy said, 4. And the pastor said, correct. Why did nobody answer it? Because they thought it was too simple. And Naaman was sort of like that at first. He said, this can't be. He said, I thought you were going to come out and wave your hand and do something fancy. I thought there was going to be some requirements. I thought there would be some. And it's just so simple. And part of what was offensive to him was that he was so accustomed to the way that he got things in his life was by his place of stature and by what he could offer somebody and what he could do and what he accomplished. And when all of his merits meant nothing, and Elisha, the great prophet of God, didn't even come out, Naaman was offended. I think Elisha didn't even come out because he wanted Naaman to understand, this isn't about me. This is about God. I don't want you to be confused and think there was religious hocus pocus that was taking place. It's about God. So you get the picture? a simple little girl has a revelation. She has a word. She has a truth. And as powerful and complicated as Naaman's life is, it's only that truth that will set him free. It's so simple. The whole next scene is to emphasize how free this offer of healing and grace and salvation is. It's so free. On the one hand, Naaman brought with him all of the things that normally would work. He had the king send a letter, great prestigious influence. He brought servants and an entourage, people who could help you get things done. Lots of wealth that you could buy something with. And he comes with all of this, and Elisha wants nothing to do with any of it. He doesn't even come out to see the impressive entourage. Elisha doesn't even know how much money Naaman may have. And so it's fascinating that on the one hand, Naaman has all of these worldly things to offer, and yet he comes with so little that he could actually offer God. He has no real knowledge of God. He hadn't studied the Torah. He hadn't made proper sacrifices. He probably didn't keep a Sabbath or wash his hands ceremonially. He didn't know the prophecies of the coming Messiah. Naaman assumed that the God of Israel was like all the other gods, that you do something for that God and that God does something for you. Like every other religion that he'd ever seen. It was like an extension of the culture. But in this case, what happens is that Naaman comes and confronts something that he's never been up against before. And that is, in order to receive, he has to give nothing. In order to receive, he has to come to this place of accepting how free it is. And the only thing that's going to rob Naaman of his healing that day is his own pride and his own arrogance and his own unwillingness to believe that something so valuable could be so free. You see, so often this is the primary stumbling block for really accepting the wonderful mercies of God, is acknowledging that what you receive from God is a gift from God. And we tend to think, well, we need to do this or we need to do that. Or the reason even sometimes it will turn our holiest attributes into something that's more about us. But you have to understand that all that you have that you could offer to God, and if it is good and you have it to offer to God, it came from God to you. Again, Pastor Ortiz said one day before he got ready to preach on stewardship, he took a deacon aside and he gave the deacon his wallet, and it had a lot of cash in it. He said, "Will you hold this for me during the service?" This wallet with a big wad of cash. The deacon said, "Yes, sir." And so he put it down in his pocket. In the middle of his sermon, Ortiz looked at the deacon on the front row and he said, "Brother," he said, "will you give me that wallet out of your pocket? I want to take it, and I want to take all the money out of it and not give it back to you." And the deacon immediately got up and brought his wallet up there, and everybody in the congregation gasped. And they were like, "What is going on here? He's just calling out people to give money to him, and they're giving money. This isn't right." And then he went on to explain what had actually happened. Because the fact of the matter was, when Ortiz said, "Will you give me that wallet out of your pocket?" it would have been wrong. It would have been a crime for him to have kept it, because it was actually the pastor's money in the first place. You got to understand, if God ever asks you for anything, it's something that He already gave to you in the first place. You can't pay God for your salvation, because anything good you have that would be worth something to give to God, God gave to you in the first place. The gospel of Jesus Christ is free. Grace is free. And the great obstacle to Naaman was he couldn't believe it could be free. The washing in the Jordan was not a symbol of something magical. There was nothing impressive about the Jordan. It's just a convenient spot to note how free and simple the gospel really is. And so he's healed. And we're told in the text that his skin becomes as a little child's. He is made new from the appearance of his skin. When you are born again, it is like you become a little child. Jesus said, unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter into the kingdom of heaven. And Elisha is suddenly confronted with Naaman at his door. Naaman is so grateful. And Naaman wants to give him a fortune. And there's nothing wrong with if Elisha had wanted to receive for his ministry wonderful gift. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how ministries are funded, of course. But in this case, Elisha knew this was not the time and this was not the place. Because the one thing he didn't want for Naaman to be confused about was this. He wanted him to know that he is not to be paid, because God is not to be paid, because the gospel is free. You can't pay for it. And so when Gehazi, Elisha's servant, who has grown up being mentored in the presence of the great man of God, sees that no payment, and he saw how wealthy this man was, he seizes upon the opportunity, goes, and he lies, and he says, we've got some young prophets have come, and they need some provisions, and he gets the money. And in this sort of powerful and disturbing scene, Naaman, who has been set free from this leprous condition, and now Gehazi takes it on. It's a graphic picture of where you can receive freely from God. There is wholeness and holiness and cleanliness, but when it is contaminated with payment and law and condemnation and manipulation and religion, it becomes something that is diseased. The gospel is so simple, and the gospel is so free. And in the end, it's a story about how powerful it is. Naaman, a Syrian, comes to Israel, hears a message that at first is offensive to him because it's too simple, but then when he is made whole, he proclaims there is no other God except the Lord. And he is converted. There is no one that is beyond the saving grace of God. There is no situation that's too difficult. Grace changes everything. Grace changes everything. It's interesting when Naaman says, just pardon me this one thing. When I go back and I go into our own temple and there I have to bow down, is this going to be okay? What is he saying? He is saying, my life has now been utterly changed. But essentially, I'm like the prime minister, and when I go with the king for matters of state, it takes place in the temple. And I'm going to get to come in to that culture and figure out how I can be this new person in the midst of my old culture. And I'm not going to worship Rimmon, this god who was the Syrian version of Baal. I'm not going to worship him because there's only one God. But when I come in and is this going to be okay? And it's interesting. Elisha simply says, I'm good with that. Well, what has happened here? He's saying, I'm going back into my culture and I'm going to try to navigate what it is to be in the world but not of the world, because now everything in my life has changed. The gospel's that powerful. What I'm saying, beloved, is that here was a simple little servant girl, and she just said, I wish my master would go to Israel. She was, in the best sense of the word, just a little girl that invited an unlikely guy to church. And it began something wherein God did an incredible miracle. I don't know what you might have been called in your life, what diminutive terms have been used about how small your life is or how small your significance might be. She was just called a little girl. And here we are heralding her today, because God can use anybody at any time to impact someone's life for eternity. The gospel is so simple because Grace is free, and grace can change anyone. And that's the gospel.